The plains of West Texas stretch wide and flat for miles. Sparse trees, open skies, long stretches of highway that curve slowly through towns separated by distance and silence. The kind of landscape where you can drive for hours without seeing more than a few headlights. The kind of place where people tend to know each other, not because the towns are small, but because the isolation makes familiarity necessary. Brandon Lawson was born into that part of the world. He grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, but later moved to San Angelo, a city where people live simply, work hard, and tend to stay close to family. He wasn't famous. He wasn't the kind of person most people outside of Texas would ever hear about. But he was known in his community. A father, a brother, a partner, someone who lived a regular life, built around work and responsibility. At the time of his disappearance, Brandon was 26 years old. He worked in the oil industry, one of the more demanding trades in that part of the country. The hours were long, the work was physical, and the pay was often good enough to support a family, even if it came with exhaustion and strain. Brandon had been in that line of work for years. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and in West Texas, steady mattered. He lived with his longtime girlfriend, Lawson. Together, they were raising 4 children, 3 from their relationship and 1 from a previous partner. They shared a home, shared responsibilities, and were navigating the same stresses that come with being young parents balancing work, bills, and long days. Friends described Brandon as a loving father, someone who made time for his children even when he was tired, someone who showed up for his family. But life had not been easy for him. In the months leading up to his disappearance, Brandon had been facing personal struggles. Like many who worked high-pressure jobs with inconsistent hours, fatigue was part of his daily life. He had also reportedly dealt with substance use in the past, specifically methamphetamines, but was said to have been trying to stay clean at the time. These details would later become part of the public narrative surrounding his case, but they were only one part of a larger picture. People who knew him didn't describe him as unstable. They described him as someone trying, someone who had ups and downs like most people do, someone who could be quiet and serious at times, but who had a deep care for the people around him. Brandon had been with Ladessa for nearly 10 years. Their relationship, by all accounts, was close but not without tension. Long hours, financial pressure, and the stress of raising children had created strain. There had been arguments, as there are in most homes, but nothing that stood out as dangerous. Nothing that suggested Brandon might walk away or disappear. They were living just outside San Angelo, not far from family. His brother Kyle was nearby. His parents were still involved in his life. It was not a life of luxury, but it was rooted in connection. That's what made what happened next so difficult to explain. Because one night in August 2013, Brandon Lawson left his home after a disagreement. And within a few hours, he was gone. In the days leading up to August 8, 2013, nothing in Brandon Lawson's life appeared to be unraveling. He was working, spending time with his children, and doing what he could to hold things together at home. The pressures were present, but they weren't new. His routine, challenging as it could be, was something he had been managing for years. Brandon and Ladessa had been together since their teenage years. They had built their lives slowly, not with ease, but with commitment. They shared the weight of responsibility in their home, just outside of San Angelo. The children were young, and their needs constant. With Brandon working long shifts in the oil fields and Ladessa managing things at home, there were few quiet moments in the household. Tension wasn't uncommon between them, but it hadn't crossed any lines that stood out to others. Those close to them said they argued sometimes about finances, about trust, about the things that pile up in a home where the adults are tired and stretched thin. But there was still trust, still a shared effort to hold the family in place. What made Brandon's disappearance so difficult to understand was how quickly things changed in a matter of hours. Earlier that week, there had been talk of stress at work. Brandon had told his brother he was feeling the pressure. He had also mentioned concerns about people he thought were watching him or following him. Whether those were grounded in something real, or whether they were tied to past drug use or anxiety, wasn't clear. It was mentioned briefly, and not followed up with urgency. That Thursday evening, Brandon came home from work. There was an argument. Some of it had to do with trust, and some of it seemed to come from a larger buildup, pressure he had been carrying silently. Ledessa later said Brandon hadn't been himself lately, that he'd been short-tempered and restless. That night, he told her he was leaving. Not permanently, just to get space. He said he was going to his father's house in Crowley, about 3 hours northeast. It was late. He had worked a full day. But he grabbed his keys, left the house, and got into his silver Ford F-150. That was the last time Ledessa saw him. He didn't make it far before he called his brother Kyle. It was around 12:30 a.m. He told Kyle he had run out of gas near Bronte, along Highway 277, a rural road northeast of San Angelo. The area is desolate at night. No lights, sparse traffic, no gas stations open nearby. Just an open two-lane highway running through brushland and fencing. Brandon asked Kyle for help. Kyle agreed. He said he'd come out and bring gas. He brought his girlfriend with him, and also arranged for a gas can. As they were driving, Brandon called again. He said something strange. He told Kyle that 3 guys were chasing him, that he was bleeding. Then the call cut out. A few minutes later, he made a 911 call. It was brief, disjointed, and hard to interpret, and it was the last confirmed time anyone heard his voice. The stretch of Highway 277 between San Angelo and Bronte, Texas, is long, straight, and unforgiving. At night, it's even more so, quiet, dimly lit, and surrounded on both sides by acres of brushland and pasture. The nearest homes are often far apart, with long driveways and locked gates. Cell phone reception is spotty. Emergency services can take time to reach you. And if you run into trouble after midnight, you're unlikely to see more than a pair of headlights every half hour. That's where Brandon Lawson found himself in the early morning hours of August 9, 2013. He had left his home just before midnight after a tense argument with Ledessa. The details of the disagreement were never fully clear to the public, but it was understood to have been emotionally charged, likely built on stress, exhaustion, and the kind of long-standing strain that slowly accumulates in a household under pressure. Brandon told Ledessa he was going to his father's house in Crowley, north of Fort Worth, several hours away. He didn't take a lot with him, just his phone, his wallet, and the clothes he was wearing. He drove his silver Ford F-150 north from San Angelo and didn't get far before trouble began. Around 12:30 a.m., he called his brother Kyle and told him he had run out of gas on Highway 277, just south of Bronte. He asked for help. Kyle didn't hesitate. He and his girlfriend Audrey loaded up a gas can and started the drive north to meet him. They knew the road well. They knew Brandon's truck. They assumed this would be simple. Bring fuel, fill the tank, head home. But that wasn't what happened. While Kyle and Audrey were en route, Brandon made another call. This one was different. He told Kyle that he was being chased. He said something about 3 guys who were following him or after him. He mentioned being in the woods, bleeding. His voice was urgent but hard to follow. Then the call dropped. The reception in that area is notoriously unreliable. Calls often cut out, especially in motion and especially at night. But this wasn't just a dropped call. It was the last time Brandon would ever speak directly to a member of his family. Seconds later, at 12:50 a.m., Brandon called 911. This call would become the most puzzling and the most studied part of his case. The full audio has been made public since then. It's a short recording, less than a minute, with Brandon's voice sounding distressed and rushed. The exact words are debated due to the static and urgency in his voice, but what's widely understood is that he says, "Yes, I'm in the middle of a field. Inaudible pulled some guys over, right here going toward Abilene on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. The guy's chasing. Inaudible, to the woods. Please hurry." The dispatcher asks for clarification, but Brandon doesn't respond clearly. Then the call ends. There was no follow-up from Brandon to 911. No second call from emergency services reaching him. He had made the call, given limited information, and then vanished from the line. What happened next added even more confusion. Kyle and Audrey arrived at Brandon's truck around 1:10 a.m. It was parked awkwardly, partly off the road, but not damaged. The doors were locked. Brandon wasn't there. Not long after, a sheriff's deputy also arrived. A passing motorist had called in the truck as abandoned or a hazard. There were now 3 people on the scene, Kyle, Audrey, and the deputy, all standing near Brandon's vehicle. But Brandon himself wasn't visible. Kyle called out into the dark, hoping Brandon was nearby. Cell service remained unreliable. At one point, Brandon tried to call Kyle back, but the call went to voicemail. Then another call came through, but when Kyle answered, the line was silent. It became clear that Brandon was no longer close enough to respond in person. Kyle thought maybe Brandon was hiding, maybe from the police, maybe because he'd had a warrant out from a previous charge. He wasn't sure. He tried to explain the situation to the deputy without going into too much detail. Eventually, after not seeing anyone around the truck and finding no sign of an accident, the deputy left. Kyle and Audrey remained on the roadside for a while longer, calling Brandon's name, sending texts, and leaving voicemails. But there was no response. Then Brandon's phone stopped ringing altogether. No more signal. No more voicemail. No more returned calls. By dawn, Kyle had left the gas can in the bed of Brandon's truck and returned home, expecting Brandon might come back for it once he calmed down. But Brandon never came back. When the sun rose over Highway 277 on the morning of August 9, 2013, Brandon Lawson's truck was still parked on the side of the road. The gas can Kyle had brought the night before was resting in the bed untouched. The driver's seat was empty. There was no note, no sign of struggle, and no indication of where Brandon had gone after his final call to 911 nearly 6 hours earlier. The road, still quiet in the early morning light, gave nothing away. It ran straight in both directions, bordered by wire fencing and brush, with a shallow ditch lining the shoulders. In daylight, it was possible to see for hundreds of yards. Still, there was no trace of movement, no footsteps in the dirt, no torn clothing, no dropped belongings. The scene was still, too still, considering what had taken place just hours before. Brandon's truck wasn't towed immediately. For a brief period, it simply sat there, part of the landscape, waiting. There was no formal investigation launched that morning. No active search party. No helicopters. No dogs. Not yet. Brandon's family was concerned, but they also knew he'd had moments before where he needed time to cool off. Maybe he'd wandered into the brush to avoid being picked up for the warrant. Maybe he was waiting somewhere nearby. It was rural Texas, after all, and people sometimes handled things without outside help. But as the hours passed, silence took over. No return. No call. No sign. Brandon's phone remained off, either dead or deliberately powered down. The sheriff's deputy who had been on scene earlier hadn't found anything alarming at the time. No blood, no items strewn across the road, nothing to indicate foul play. And because of that, there was no immediate sense of urgency from law enforcement. The family, though, began to feel the shift. Something wasn't right. Brandon wouldn't have stayed gone this long. He wouldn't have left his truck, knowing someone had brought gas for him. He wouldn't have gone silent. By the end of that first day, Kyle and other relatives returned to the area, retracing the ground between the truck and the brush beyond it. They called his name. They searched the nearby fields. They knocked on ranch gates. There were no houses close enough for Brandon to have reached easily in the dark, especially if he had been injured. And if he'd been hiding, he'd had hours to come back out. But he hadn't, and no one had seen him. The calls from that night became the focus almost immediately. Brandon's 911 call, in particular, stood out, not just for what he said, but for how he said it. His voice was panicked but coherent. He wasn't slurring his words. He wasn't rambling. He sounded breathless, afraid. He said he was in a field. He said someone was chasing him. He said he needed help. And then he went silent. The audio was reviewed repeatedly, but interpretations varied. The static on the line made certain words difficult to hear. Some heard pulled some guys over. Others heard got shot. The tone was clear, but the specifics remained unclear. The dispatcher had tried to get information, but the call was short. No location was pinned. No follow-up came. The call ended, and the line went dead. Law enforcement later said the call hadn't sounded like a clear emergency. They thought perhaps Brandon had been hallucinating. Perhaps he had taken something. That explanation would persist for years, despite the fact that no toxicology report could ever be done, and no one had seen him using drugs that night. What remained were assumptions. His family didn't agree with that line of thinking. They believed Brandon had been in danger, real danger, that he had seen something, or someone, that he had run, not because he was disoriented, but because he was afraid. Kyle's phone records added more depth to the timeline. After Brandon called 911, he also made several attempts to call Kyle, Ledessa, and even 911 again. But service was weak, and most of those calls failed or went to voicemail. In total, he made more than 10 calls in a 30-minute span. And then his phone stopped working altogether, either powered off or out of battery. That was the last electronic trace of him. From 1:15 a.m. onward, Brandon Lawson disappeared into the landscape. The days that followed were filled with growing concern. On August 10th, Brandon's family reported him missing officially. They pressed the local sheriff's department to take action. A search was started, though limited in scope. Volunteers were allowed to walk the fence lines and brush areas near where the truck had been found. But it wasn't a formal search and rescue effort, not at first. Without signs of foul play, the case didn't meet the threshold for full-scale deployment. Cadaver dogs were not brought in during the early days. Aerial scans were not done in the first week. The assumption, by some in law enforcement, was that Brandon had wandered off under the influence of drugs and would return on his own once the situation cooled down. But that explanation didn't sit right with those who knew him best. Brandon had made calls for help. He had reached out to his brother multiple times. He had left his vehicle behind, not because he wanted to disappear, but because he thought someone was after him. He had said he was bleeding. He had said he needed the police. He had said, "Please hurry," and then he was gone. In the days after Brandon Lawson was officially reported missing, the flatlands surrounding Highway 277 became the focus of a quiet and increasingly desperate search. The area where his truck had been found wasn't densely populated, nor was it equipped with the kind of infrastructure that made wide-scale searching easy. There were no streetlights, no nearby security cameras, and little to no foot traffic. It was, in every sense, an in-between place, somewhere you passed through on the way to somewhere else. But now, for those who loved Brandon, it was the last known location, and the only place where hope could still be directed. The family returned often in those early days, walking slowly along the fence lines, scanning the dirt shoulders, and venturing into the low scrub brush that ran just beyond the roadway. There were barbed wire fences stretching along both sides of the highway, separating the road from private ranch lands that extended for miles in either direction. In some places, the brush was sparse. In others, thick enough to obscure anything that might be lying just a few feet beyond the road's edge. Even in daylight, the terrain was easy to underestimate. At night, it would have been disorienting. By now, Brandon's phone had stopped working entirely. There was no GPS ping to follow, no location history to trace. His truck, examined more closely, gave no new information. It had indeed run out of gas. The vehicle showed no signs of damage, no evidence of forced entry or violence, no blood or clothing left behind. The keys were gone. So was Brandon. That was all they had. Local law enforcement maintained that the case was being treated as a missing person investigation. But those closest to the search began to feel the limits of that designation. Without hard evidence of a crime, certain investigative tools weren't deployed. Officers patrolled the area and reviewed what they had: vehicle logs, phone records, witness statements. But it wasn't the kind of all-out search effort some expected. No grid-based tracking. No sustained use of aerial scans or infrared. No drones. Not in those early weeks. Brandon's family, especially his brother Kyle, began to take matters into their own hands. Kyle returned again and again to the stretch of highway where he had last seen Brandon's truck. He walked both directions, looking for footprints, discarded clothing, anything that might have offered a clue. He reached out to locals, to landowners, and to anyone who might be willing to let volunteers walk the land. Over time, permission was granted to search some of the surrounding private property, but not all. In rural Texas, large tracts of land are tightly controlled. Without formal warrants or probable cause, many areas remained legally off-limits. Theories began to circulate, slowly at first. Some believed Brandon had simply panicked and run into the brush, possibly under the influence, and become lost or disoriented. Temperatures that night had dropped, and the terrain was rough. If he had been injured, dehydrated, or confused, it wouldn't have taken long for him to collapse out of sight. Others pointed to his warrant and suggested he might have fled intentionally, choosing to disappear rather than face legal trouble. But these ideas were met with quiet resistance from those who knew him best. If he had wanted to leave, why call for help? Why make over a dozen calls that night to his brother, his girlfriend, 911? Why leave his truck in a place where it would so easily be found? And why not come back the next day, once the tension had settled and the moment had passed? His family didn't believe he had planned to vanish. They didn't believe he had staged anything. What they did believe more and more was that something had happened in those fields that night. Something he had seen or heard that had made him afraid enough to run. Whether it was a threat from someone else, a misunderstanding, or the result of an internal state no one could fully understand, they didn't know. But what mattered to them wasn't what Brandon may have believed in those final moments. What mattered was that no one had found him. Not yet. More than once, cadaver dogs were brought to the area. Search groups fanned out in loose formations. People drove in from other towns to help. The area was combed multiple times. But without knowing which direction Brandon had taken, or how far he might have gone, those efforts came up short. The land was too large, the timeline too narrow, the clues too few. Some locals reported seeing lights in the area that night. Others recalled hearing a voice or spotting movement. But these observations came hours too late, and nothing could be confirmed. No neighboring landowners reported finding clothing, discarded items, or signs of someone passing through their property. If Brandon had made it beyond the road and into the dense sections of land that lay beyond, he had left almost no trace. As the days turned into weeks, the search slowed. The landscape was unforgiving, and each day that passed made it less likely that Brandon would be found by chance. But his family didn't stop returning. When a person disappears suddenly, the first days are spent in motion. Calls to friends, visits to the area, conversations with law enforcement, searching through records, driving and walking and rechecking what's already been checked. In those early hours, the energy is driven by urgency, by the belief that if you act quickly enough, the answers will come. But when time begins to pass without progress, something else settles in. It isn't stillness exactly. It's a slower kind of waiting, a quiet, steady pressure that lives in the background of everything. That was the space Brandon Lawson's family began to live in after the first week came and went without any sign of him. There were no new leads, no sightings, no confirmed movement after 1:19 a.m. on the morning of August 9th, when his phone last connected to a tower. That final ping came from somewhere close to where his truck had been left. After that, there was only silence. The authorities continued to describe the case as open, but there was no formal search effort active day to day. The land had been checked in sections. His truck had been towed. The file remained open with the Cope County Sheriff's Office, but there were no new developments being shared. Brandon's family, meanwhile, were left in the same position they had been in since that morning, returning to the highway, walking the same stretches, asking the same questions. What made it harder was the lack of definitive evidence. There were no witnesses to a struggle, no signs of violence, no abandoned items or blood, just a voicemail, a few fragments of a recorded 911 call, a locked truck with a gas can in the bed, and a family who knew deep down that something was wrong, even if no one else could say exactly what it was. Brandon's brother Kyle took the burden personally. He had spoken to Brandon that night, more than once. He had gone out to meet him. He had stood near that truck while Brandon was still trying to reach him by phone. The timeline never left him. He carried it around like a map with no landmarks, just a sequence of missed moments that couldn't be reversed. He replayed the night again and again. How Brandon had told him someone was chasing him. How the 911 call had made no sense, yet sounded serious. How the deputy had arrived, then left, before anything felt fully checked. There was no way to undo any of it, only the constant attempt to make sense of it. Hal stayed involved. So did Ledessa, Brandon's girlfriend. Even after their relationship ended in the aftermath of his disappearance, she continued to help coordinate awareness efforts, answer media inquiries, and keep Brandon's name visible. For both of them, the story had become something that didn't allow for resolution, only repetition. They printed flyers, set up pages, made calls. They spoke to reporters and online communities. They corrected misinformation. They asked for access to land. They asked again. Some helped. Some turned them away. There was no central authority directing the search. And that lack of structure meant the weight fell back on the family, over and over. Behind the effort, grief began to take root in more subtle ways. Brandon's children grew older without answers. His parents, quiet through much of the early media attention, held their own space for remembering him. Friends who had once walked with search teams had returned to work, moved to other towns, or had families of their own. Not out of indifference, just life continuing, while one part of it stayed frozen. For those closest to him, that didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning how to carry uncertainty, to live without a moment of finality, to hold on to someone, not in memory alone, but in the quiet conviction that they should still be here. And always the same road. Highway 277. Flat. Unchanging. A place you could drive past 100 times and never notice. Unless you knew what had happened there. Unless you were still waiting for someone to return from the other side of it. As the first year passed, Brandon Lawson's case moved from an active search into something quieter, more uncertain, and in many ways more difficult to bear. The lack of answers hadn't changed, but the shape of the attention surrounding his disappearance had. Public interest, initially local and grounded in physical searches, began to shift into online spaces. There, the case took on a second life, picked apart, analyzed, and questioned by people who hadn't known Brandon, but were drawn to the strange and incomplete nature of the story. At the heart of that interest was the 911 call. It had always been the most tangible piece of evidence, a direct line to Brandon's final known moment, captured in his own voice. The call was brief, filled with static and stress, recorded in the early hours of the morning when he was alone on a rural highway, describing a situation no one fully understood. It was 1 minute long, but for many, that minute raised more questions than it answered. When the audio was first made public, it was difficult to hear clearly. Background noise, poor reception, and Brandon's anxious tone made it challenging to transcribe accurately. Listeners disagreed on the wording, especially in the middle of the call. What was meant by "pulled some guys over"? If that's what he actually said, was he referring to law enforcement or using guys in a general way? Was he a witness to something? A victim of something? Or was he confused? Debates formed around each fragment of speech. Where some heard panic rooted in reality, others heard the signs of someone disoriented or hallucinating. The possibility of drug use was raised again and again, not just by online commentators, but by law enforcement early on, who suggested that methamphetamine or other stimulants might have influenced Brandon's behavior. It's true that he had a past history with substance use, but whether he had used anything that night was impossible to confirm. No one saw him take anything. No toxicology could ever be done, and no evidence of drugs was found in or around his truck. Even so, the theory stuck. As time passed, more theories emerged. Some believed Brandon may have witnessed something illegal, and that he had been chased away or silenced by those involved. Others thought he had been hiding from police because of his warrant, and had gotten lost or fallen victim to the elements. A few speculated about mental health, suggesting a sudden episode of paranoia or distress that had led him away from the road and into the dark. But every theory reached a limit, because without a body, without belongings, without footprints or security footage, all that remained was absence. An absence that no speculation could fill. Brandon's family watched these conversations unfold quietly, sometimes with gratitude for the attention, and sometimes with fatigue. For them, it was never a theory. It was never a riddle to solve from a distance. It was their son, their brother, their partner, and their father, gone without a sound, leaving behind a truck on the side of the road and a message they couldn't make sense of. They read what others wrote. They listened to the call again and again, and still they returned to the same point. Brandon had asked for help. He had called 911. He had tried to reach his brother. Whatever happened that night, he hadn't planned it. He hadn't run away. He had made a series of desperate calls from a place where he believed something was going wrong. And then nothing. By 2014, the searches had grown less frequent, but not less focused. Kyle and others organized volunteer groups when they could. A few locals offered land access. Some allowed dogs to be brought in. Others allowed drones to fly overhead. But the scale of the area made it nearly impossible to cover fully without direction. There was no starting point, no trail to follow, no confirmed direction of travel. Just the truck, the call, and the stretch of highway where something had gone wrong, in a way no one could name. By the second and third year after Brandon Lawson vanished, his family had settled into a life shaped quietly around absence. The searches still happened, though less often. Calls to the sheriff's department became infrequent. The immediate energy of those early days, the urgent coordination of volunteers, the long hours in the heat, the constant back and forth of ideas, had shifted into something slower and more painful, waiting. For Brandon's brother Kyle, the weight of that night never truly lifted. He had replayed each minute so many times, not just the calls they exchanged, but the small choices that now felt heavier in hindsight. He had gone to meet Brandon. He had brought gas. He had spoken to him just before everything went quiet. And for years afterward, even with nothing new to go on, he kept showing up. He returned to the area again and again, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, walking the same ground, scanning the terrain that had already been searched, not because he expected a sudden discovery, but because leaving it untouched felt wrong. That part of Coke County had become something else entirely for the Lawson family. Not just a location, but a place suspended in memory. The road, the fence line, the still air. Each part of it held unanswered questions. Brandon's parents spoke about him rarely in public, but they remained present in the background of everything that was done. In the earliest days, they had hoped for some mistake, a delayed return, an accident with a survivable end. But the longer he stayed gone, the more the idea of survival faded, even if they never spoke of it in final terms. They kept his things where they'd always been. His clothes, his photos, small tokens of his everyday life. Nothing was moved, and no one called it closure. Ledessa, the mother of his children, continued to support awareness efforts. She remained measured in what she shared, careful not to feed into speculation or theories she couldn't verify. For her, the loss was not abstract. It was daily. Her children had grown older in the years since. They asked questions. They looked at old pictures. They had memories that were soft around the edges now, but still sharp enough to feel the absence. In small towns like San Angelo, time moves forward, but it doesn't erase much. Brandon's name remained known there, not as gossip, not as scandal, but as an open story. One people remembered when they passed that stretch of highway. One they thought of on certain nights when the road was dark and still, and the stars sat low over the land. For those who knew him, even distantly, the disappearance never made sense. Not because Brandon was a symbol of something greater, but because he was someone they had shared time with. Someone who had been part of the ordinary rhythm of life, and then wasn't. The family never stopped hoping for answers, but they no longer expected sudden resolution. They learned to live in a kind of in-between space, where a missing person is neither gone nor present. They weren't preparing for a moment of return, and they weren't planning memorials. They were simply living with what they knew, and with everything they didn't. For every theory that appeared online or every tip that came in from someone new to the case, the family stayed grounded. They didn't feed rumors. They didn't speculate in interviews. They simply returned to the facts. Brandon had left his home after a disagreement. He'd driven north, run out of gas, called for help, and then made a 911 call that suggested something was very wrong. He had made several attempts to reach people. He had sounded afraid, and after that night there was nothing. No possessions had ever been found. No trace of movement past his last phone signal. No confirmed sightings. Just open land. And time. The land where Brandon Lawson was last seen never changed much. The stretch of Highway 277 between San Angelo and Bronte remained what it had always been. Quiet, flat, and slow to give up its secrets. Years passed. Brush grew thicker in places, fences were repaired, and the gravel shoulders shifted slightly with weather and traffic. But the essential shape of the place stayed the same. And for 8 long years, that stretch of road carried a question. Brandon's family never stopped searching. The formal search efforts faded after the first year, but his loved ones continued, walking that land in pieces, studying maps, watching the light at different hours, wondering how far someone could get on foot after midnight. Even when there were no new leads, they kept going, not in expectation, but in quiet obligation. His brother Kyle returned to the area dozens of times, sometimes with others, sometimes alone. There was always a sense that he might still be there, somewhere close, that perhaps he had made it just out of view, collapsed in a low spot behind the brush line, or beyond a fence never crossed. That maybe the right person would stumble onto something, even after all this time. And eventually someone did. On February 4th, 2022, human remains were found near the area where Brandon had disappeared. The discovery was made on private land, not far from the road. The location had been searched in the past, but the landowner had recently granted renewed access. The remains were partial, weathered by time and exposure. Alongside them were pieces of clothing and a wallet. There was no press conference, no dramatic announcement, just a quiet confirmation from the Texas Department of Public Safety that DNA testing had been completed and that the remains belonged to Brandon Lawson. After nearly a decade, the question of where had finally been answered. But the how, and especially the why, remained silent. The confirmation brought with it a strange kind of stillness. Brandon's family had long lived with uncertainty. The idea that they might never find him had been part of every season, every year, every family gathering since 2013. Now, with the knowledge that his remains had been there all along, just out of reach, another kind of silence took shape. There was no new information about what had happened in those final moments. No evidence of foul play had been confirmed. No weapon had been found. No injuries were described in public statements. Law enforcement declined to elaborate, stating only that the case was now closed. For some, this was seen as an ending. For the people closest to Brandon, it was something else. It was a return, yes, but not of the answers they had hoped for. Not of the moment of clarity they had imagined in the early days. Instead, it was a quiet arrival at a place where only absence had lived for so long. The questions didn't disappear. If anything, they sharpened. How had Brandon ended up in that spot, so close to where his truck had been found? Why hadn't the earliest searches located him? Had he wandered, injured and afraid, until he collapsed? Had someone helped cover his tracks, or had he simply gone unseen? And why had that phone call, his last trace of voice, sounded so much like someone running from something? None of those answers came with the DNA report. None were written in the brush or the dirt. The only thing that had changed was that Brandon was no longer missing. He was no longer a name tied to coordinates and timelines. He was home. When Brandon Lawson was officially found, nearly 9 years after he vanished, the news did not travel quickly. There were no flashing headlines, no extended coverage from national outlets. The announcement came in measured, quiet tones. Just a few lines from the Texas Department of Public Safety confirming what Brandon's family had already begun to understand. He had been there all along, not far from where his truck was found, not far from where his brother had stood on the shoulder of the road that night, calling his name into the dark. His remains were located only a short distance from where it all had ended. That closeness brought its own kind of weight. It wasn't comfort. It was something else. A realization that the answers they had searched for were never out of reach, only hidden by time, distance, and the sheer complexity of rural space. The land had been searched in pieces over the years. Some areas had been walked multiple times. But the terrain, even though open in appearance, held thick patches of brush, uneven footing, and sharp fencing. It didn't take much to vanish in that kind of country. A few hundred feet, a turn behind a fence, and someone could remain unseen for years. Brandon's family received the news not with relief, but with quiet grief. His parents had waited so long without knowing where he was. They had spent seasons surrounded by uncertainty. Every holiday, every birthday, every passing year marked by the same open space. They never tried to explain it away. They never filled that silence with hopeful guesses. Now that part of the silence had a name. The remains were returned to the family. There were no public services announced immediately. Nothing performative. No interviews with flashing microphones. The family chose to process the news privately, with the same kind of quiet strength they had shown throughout the years of searching. They had never sensationalized his story. They had never demanded attention. What mattered now was that he would rest. His children, older now, had grown up in the shadow of his absence. The older ones had faint memories. The younger ones had grown up with pictures and quiet stories. Now they had a place to visit, a final point on the map where his name would no longer just drift in speculation. They could begin slowly to turn toward something more permanent. For Kyle, the news landed in more complicated ways. He had been part of every moment, driving out to the highway that night, standing by the truck, hearing the phone go quiet. He had carried the burden of what-ifs for nearly a decade. He had organized searches, coordinated volunteers, answered questions, and protected Brandon's name when the narrative got too far from the truth. Finding Brandon didn't undo any of that. It just added a kind of stillness that hadn't been there before. There would be no new clues now, no deeper understanding. The questions that had followed them for years, about the phone call, about the mention of danger, about whether someone else had been involved, remained open. But with Brandon found, the energy that had once gone into motion shifted inward. There was nothing left to search for, only something to live with. Some members of the public accepted the resolution as final. Brandon had left his home upset. He had walked away from his truck, possibly in distress, possibly under the influence, and had gotten lost or collapsed in the field nearby. The timeline, though never perfect, now had a closing chapter. But others, especially those who had studied the case for years, found the ending incomplete. The 911 call still didn't make sense. The panic in his voice, the confusion in his words, the suggestion that someone else was nearby, even if no one else had ever come forward. No answers came from the land where he was found. No indication of a second person. No signs of a struggle. And no evidence pointing to a clear cause of death. Law enforcement classified the case as closed. But for those who had followed every step, the mystery still lingered. No longer in the question of where, but in the deeper silence of why. In the years between Brandon Lawson's disappearance and the confirmation of his death, something had quietly grown around his name. Not notoriety, not fame, but presence. A steady, respectful recognition that this man, who had vanished without warning from a Texas highway in the middle of the night, mattered. Not just to his family, not just to those who searched, but to thousands of people who had never met him at all. It had started in small, familiar ways. Printed flyers on gas station windows, word of mouth through friends of the family, and quiet conversations held in church lobbies and living rooms. But as time moved forward and the mystery remained, the story made its way online. On forums, on social media, in podcasts, people from around the world began to ask what had happened on that highway. They listened to the 911 call. They studied the map. They reached out to Kyle. They made timelines, shared theories, and, at least in the best cases, offered compassion more than speculation. Through all of that, Brandon's family remained constant. They did not build a movement. They did not seek attention, but they did not turn away from it either. They answered messages. They stayed present in the conversation, not to add to the mystery, but to humanize it. They reminded people that this wasn't an unsolved riddle. It was their son, their brother, the father of 4 children. And when Brandon was found, they didn't ask the world to stop looking back. They simply asked it to remember him clearly. Kyle Lawson, more than anyone, had carried that responsibility. For nearly a decade, he lived in parallel with the search, balancing a job, a family of his own, and the constant weight of knowing he had spoken to his brother in what turned out to be his final moments. He had driven to the scene. He had stood near the truck. He had walked into the darkness more times than anyone could count, wondering if he had somehow missed him. Those memories didn't vanish when Brandon was found. They became heavier in a different way. The knowledge that his brother had been just out of reach, that his voice had been real and his fear valid, that maybe more could have been done that night if anyone had known where to look. It stayed with Kyle. Not as blame, not as regret, but as a quiet, permanent ache. Still, he never let it turn bitter. He chose action instead of resentment. He organized searches. He opened communication channels with others who had lost loved ones in similar circumstances. He stood with families of the missing, not to tell them what would happen, but to offer the only thing he truly could, presence. He didn't pretend to have answers. He just didn't disappear. That became his way of honoring Brandon, by continuing to show up, even when the rest of the world moved on. Brandon's case became part of a wider conversation about rural disappearances, about how quickly a person can vanish in places where cell towers don't reach, where there are no cameras, where roads stretch flat for miles without witnesses. People began to use his story as a reminder of the vulnerabilities that exist outside the cities. Not in the context of blame, but to ask how search protocols could improve, how families could be supported better, how silence could be challenged gently but consistently. The legacy wasn't built on conclusions. It was built on care. Brandon's name appeared in online communities, yes, but also in support groups, law enforcement seminars, and state-level meetings focused on missing persons. His case was mentioned alongside others with similar echoes. Sudden departure, confusing audio, long silence. Each one different, each one painful, but each one now threaded together by the quiet efforts of families who refused to stop remembering. Ledessa, though no longer with Kyle, kept Brandon's name alive for the sake of their children. As they grew older, she made sure they had access to the truth. Not rumors or guesses, but the real story of what had happened or what hadn't. She shared pictures. She answered questions when they came. She gave them room to form their own understanding of who their father had been and what his absence had meant. The kids, by the time Brandon's remains were found, had grown into new stages of life. School, activities, friends. But they carried him with them, even if quietly. His memory wasn't wrapped in mystery for them. It was part of their identity. Something unspoken, perhaps, but not forgotten. The land itself, where he had been found, remained private. The family made no plans to turn it into a symbol. It was enough to know the place, to have a point on the map, to be able to mark it, visit it, say goodbye. There was no public vigil, no ceremony, just a return to stillness. The same kind of stillness that had defined the years of waiting. Only now there was a name to place in the silence. And that changed everything. The story of Brandon Lawson never came with a final moment of clarity. When his remains were found in early 2022, it brought an answer to a single question: where he had gone, but it did not explain the night. It didn't untangle the confusion of his last phone call, or make sense of why he ran, or what made him afraid enough to disappear into the dark. The facts remained as they had been. He left his home after an argument, called for help, and was never seen alive again. But there was something in the return, in the act of finding him after so long, that shifted the weight. For his family, it did not bring closure in the way people often expect. It didn't fix what had been broken, and it didn't undo the years of not knowing. But it gave them a place, a point where the uncertainty no longer stretched forward indefinitely. A a place where they could stop searching. They did not hold a press event. There was no ceremony to mark the recovery, at least not publicly. What needed to happen, happened quietly. The same way they had waited for him, without spectacle, without anger, just with a deep and steady resolve. The landscape where Brandon had been found remained unchanged. A patch of land in West Texas, bordered by ranch fences and rough grass, just far enough from the road to be missed in the early searches. From the highway, you'd never know the story. You'd drive past and see only flat ground, sky, and a stretch of Tulane road leading into the horizon. But for those who knew, that land was no longer empty. It carried a history now, a presence. Brandon's story stayed with people in quiet ways. For many in his family, and for those who had searched alongside them, it became part of how they saw the world. The effort to keep him visible taught them something about patience. It showed them how silence can stretch across years, but also how it can be filled, not with noise, but with consistency, with truth, with love that doesn't ask for attention. In online spaces, his case continued to be spoken about, not in the frantic way of unsolved mysteries, but as a reflection of what it means to lose someone without warning and to go years without answers. His name became shorthand for how easy it is to disappear in rural places, how fast communication breaks down, how systems falter in the face of uncertainty. But even there, the tone began to shift. As more people learned the outcome, the focus moved away from what might have happened and toward how people responded. The dignity of his family, the commitment of his brother, the years of unanswered calls and unanswered questions met not with outrage, but with determination. His name is still spoken with care. And now, when it's said, it no longer hangs in midair. It rests. Brandon's parents held on to what mattered most, that he had been found, and that he had been carried home. They did not try to define his life by the night he disappeared. They remembered the years before, his voice, his laughter, the way he cared for his children, the ordinary moments that made up who he was. For his children, those memories were inherited through stories, pictures, and quiet conversations. There was no attempt to make him into a symbol. He was their father, and now, finally, they knew where he was. In the end, Brandon Lawson's story never offered the certainty people often expect from a disappearance. But what remained, after all the questions, the silence, and the long wait, was a kind of peace. Not because the mystery had been solved, but because those who loved him never let go. And sometimes, that's what lasts longest of all.